Greetings, my brothers and sisters. Sending gratitude to all of you who are joining in today to accompany us down the rabbit hole of self-exploration through plant medicines. My name is Ryan Sprague, and I'm here to tell you that your frequency is now set and tuned to explore psychedelic medicines and the impact they've made among the countless psychonauts exploring the last true frontier. Buy a ticket and take the ride with me as we get true firsthand accounts of the experiences, benefits, risks, and transformations taking place within the ever-expanding world of psychedelic medicines on This One Time on Psychedelics. If there is one thing I have realized in the last 5 years while on the spiritual path, it's that I know that I do not know. That being said, within that ever-expanding realization of not knowing, something I have come to believe from my personal experiences with plant medicines and ancient practices is that we are each limitless in our potential in this life. Today's guests on the show are two people that embody this notion and share it with those they work with and the collective at large through their psychedelic therapy practices. Not only this, but they also practice the sacred art of sex as the connection vehicle of the divine in human form. They are both dedicated and committed to helping humanity uplevel their experience of life through psychology, psychedelics, intimacy, and mastering all the aspects of the human being. And believe me when I say that this episode is going to empower each person who chooses to engage and feel the lessons within emanating from their souls. So with all of that information and intention being set, please give me a big hand in welcoming Ani Manian and Lee Noto to the show. What's up, guys?
Hey,
that was such a beautiful intro.
Oh, thank you. It was two things, right? I mean, looking into your guys' background and just the vibe I got from you guys when I was looking into you, I was like, these guys are awesome. Like, I've said this on multiple shows and people probably think I'm on repeat, but when you immediately get that bunk bed status feeling when you look at people, you're like, we're going to be best friends, And so that was exactly what I felt from you guys, coupled with, I was watching some Gaia today and the show Initiation, and they were talking a lot about just different spiritual practices and such. And I put in some carbon-based life forms and got inspired and wrote that intro, and it just flowed out of me. And I was so excited to have you guys on and have you guys hear it. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I just have to remark that experiencing that intro shifted me. There was something that was poetic about it, very thoughtful, articulate, and it tuned me into something that I wasn't tuned into right before hopping on the call.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah, I think one of the best things that humans can do from one another, and it's so simple in nature, right? But these days with the left brain complicating everything to death, is just be battery chargers for others, right? Like to allow them to enter a vibration that they weren't in before, right? And change their lease. And, I think I speak for all three of us in the show when I say we do our fair share of self-development stuff, but a lot of times I know speaking for myself, I do these practices alone, right? And so sometimes, the art of spoken word can just help raise that vibration. And so it's amazing that I was able to help you with that.
And it's funny, a lot of what I do and how I operate and how I work with myself has, while it started out as a form of self-development, but it's evolved into actually a deconstruction of the self. Because what I find is that a core part of what ails society is an overcorrection into being absorbed with our sense of self, being so centered in ourselves, being so obsessed with protecting this fabricated construct known as the self, right? And whether it's this idea of Ryan, whether this is this sense of who Lee is, whether this manufactured definition of what Ani is, it's just a collection of stories. It's a collection of memories and thoughts and perceptions and interpretations. And it also becomes the ultimate prison for each and every human being. And when we identify with this prison, then we immediately create a separation between who lives inside and who lives on the other side, who lives outside. Right? And we create a boundary around ourselves. And because we are one speck in this universe, we feel limited. And so the three primary problems of the human being arise. That is a sense of lack, a sense of limitation, and a sense of separation. And all of these come back to this fundamental notion, this fundamental misconception that I am this limited, separate self, right? And that idea, when left unquestioned, is responsible for pretty much all of our suffering. And when we really investigate into that, we find that there's actually nothing there. There's no such thing as Ryan,
Yes.
right? We can define a Ryan right now based on, the context in which we interact as a podcast host, as someone who's a leader in the space. But if we look really deeply, there's no such thing, right? And as we unwind that, right, we dissolve the self, right? And so I want to propose a radically different idea for what we consider self-development, right? As the goal being to deconstruct the self. But also, that's half the story, because I think that's where a lot of the spiritual world lives and dies, right? Because they are obsessed with the spiritual. And I actually think the highest form of spirituality, the highest form of personal evolution, is actually the perfect marriage of the spiritual and the material. We must learn to be in the material world because we are embodied. We are embodied. And to be fully embodied, we must be in this form. We must live and navigate the world of form with some elegance, ideally. So it's, the spiritual, but it's also the material. So it's the deconstruction of the self, but it's also the intentional and conscious reconstruction of the self, right? In our highest form, in our highest potential, to express and experience our most limitless self. And that's, I think, the real juice.
Yes. I believe could be Rumi. I could be getting this wrong, but you are not a drop in the ocean, but rather the ocean in the drop. Right. I think that perfectly summarizes what you were speaking to there. And, it also reminds me of, Ram Dass, be here now. Right. Like, I always say that although I love spirituality, like I'm still going to enjoy being human. I'm still going to taste the flavors and smell the smells and do all of that because that's my purpose. Right. Like, people ask a lot, clients I work with, and just I get into some interesting conversations, and people are like, so how do I find my purpose? I'm like, it's really, it starts inner, right? Like what you were talking about. It starts by discovering what and who you truly are. And then from there, it's like, what are you doing in the moment, right? Like right now, our purpose is to be on this podcast, right? And then after, it'll be to go on with our day and do whatever we end up doing. And so I feel as though by taking ourselves less seriously as well, we can open up that ability to realize that we are so much more than just a drop in the ocean, right? Like we get to experience being the drop, right? But what opens up is being able to realize that, within that drop, you're actually everything.
Right. And, I never thought I'd be taking something that Rumi said and improving it, but I'm going to try to do that. I would assert that we are both a drop in the ocean and the entire ocean in a drop. And if we can hold that dichotomy, if we can hold the paradox. So I believe that our ability to be successful, abundant, self-actualized really centers on our ability to hold paradoxes, because life is rarely black and white. Life is rarely, if ever, absolute, right? And it's this ability to hold these opposing sides of the same idea, the same concept, the same belief system that really allows us to fully express ourselves and fully experience life, which, speaking of purpose, I believe that's our purpose. It's to express and it's to experience. And so what if we are both the drop and the ocean? Can we hold the paradox of both, right? Can we embody that intersection? Can we navigate ourselves seamlessly along that spectrum and allow what wants to emerge, in a seamless way, in a way that's a co-creative dance with the universe?
Something that came through to me in that too is that it's the whole law of polarity, right? Like a lot of times, I know for many years I fell into this, but I imagine many people think that like good and evil are two different things, but really they're just opposite poles of the same thing, right? It's like if you look at temperature, right? This is an easy way to relate it to people. Like hot and cold are just opposite poles of the same system, right? And you can see it directly on the thermometer, right? And they're really only in relation to our own body heat, right? If we're hotter, then something that's cooler is going to feel cold. Something that's hotter, if we're cold, is going to feel hot, right? And so it's so interesting getting into that. And I'm curious, for both of you, how did you first become interested in these things, right? Psychedelics, intimacy, the unknown / known, right? Like, spirituality, I mean, I'm aware now at this point that it's not everyone's lifetime that they're going to become interested in this, right? And that's not right or wrong. It's just everyone's got a different flavor of ice cream they resonate with in this experience of life. And so I'm curious why you guys picked this lifetime to experience this flavor of ice cream. Hey, everybody. I hope you're enjoying the show. I wanted to take a quick moment to let you all know that the doors are officially open for the Conscious Cannabis Collective. And as such, this is the last week you can sign up and receive all of the bonuses we're currently including. This is the last time I will be personally onboarding those of you who sign up with a complimentary one-on-one session, and you'll have the ability to get the Grow with Cannabis course for free during this limited time. For more info on how you can take advantage of this offer, head down to the show notes for this episode and secure your spot today, as we only have so many spots left and they are filling up quickly. Now back to the show.
I always say that to have stepped into this lifetime, to be living this life, I must have done a lot of really good things in past lifetimes, because I feel so fortunate to be here. And it's no mistake that Ani and I came together in this lifetime, as I think we have in many past lifetimes. And funny enough, the day that I met him, I said to him, I think you're the man that I've been asking for. I typically don't say things like that to people, but the words came out of my mouth, and something told me that we would be leading work together. So I thought of this in a professional context, because I had already found intimacy work prior to meeting Ani, and I felt very empowered in that work. And that was something, an understanding and a knowing that I had had for most of my life, that I had a different curiosity about intimacy, anatomy, sexuality. And as I was leading this work, as someone who identifies as a woman, I felt curious about what it would be like to have a masculine embodied counterpart to lead this work with, to literally represent the masculine and feminine polarity through the work that we lead. And so that was my request to the universe, was please send me a male embodied person to lead this work with me. And that has changed the game in terms of how I understand intimacy, how I understand relationships, how I understand polarity, because now I live every day an embodied experience of what it's like to play these dynamics out in a very real way. And so that was sort of the story around the intimacy work. And the psychedelics wraps perfectly into that. And that was work that both of us were doing prior to meeting each other. And I was studying in a Shipibo lineage with some indigenous shamans, and started my work in the context through the lens of spirituality, spiritual exploration, getting to understand myself better, more deeply, and then taking that understanding and using that as a way to enact positive change in the world. And upon meeting Ani, he brought this beautiful flavor of not only spirituality to the work that we do in psychedelics and deeper meaning, but also developmental psychology, neuroscience, and this huge lens of how we are exploring our own consciousness and our own potential through these substances, which can serve as catalysts.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I would consider myself on many levels an accidental entrant into the space in some ways. And in other ways, I feel like this is just who I've been my entire life. I was born in India, and I grew up there, which is the home of, a lot of really deep ancient spirituality. A lot of the concepts and the ideas and the ways of being that are practiced in the West in a spiritual context originated there. And so I grew up with this really, really, really deep spiritual backdrop. And I moved to New York solo when I was 17, didn't know a single person in the country, which could be thought of as the epitome of the material world. Right. And so, but I was called here. I was called here since I was the age of 12, is when I first received this knowing that I must go to New York. And I grew up, relatively poor, and I studied for the SATs after school and did well enough that schools came to interview me and they gave me a full ride. And I've been following these whispers my entire life. And for some reason, I've trusted them. And for some reason, they've led me to a good place. But my story is riddled with so much pain. I tried to kill myself multiple times at the age of 7. My dad was physically abusive. And, I experienced so much trauma, so much pain that I spent my adult life numbing it with pretty much everything that I could get my hands on, whether that was working, trying to make money, trying to survive as an immigrant in the country, women, sex, love, movement, athletics, sports, working out, fitness, travel. I've been to over 60 countries before I turned 30. But much to my dismay, wherever I went, there I was, as the saying goes.
Yes.
And I just couldn't escape my pain, right? No matter what I did, no matter what outlets I found, no matter what I used to numb myself, I just couldn't get away from it. And it wasn't until my dad unexpectedly passed away that I came face to face with mortality in a real way, in a really raw and visceral way. And I was cremating his dead body, and I started seeing all the ways in which I was like him, ways that I liked, ways that I didn't. And I just realized how much self-loathing, how much just discomfort with myself, how much pain and suffering and trauma that I was holding. And so, the path was clear. A window of pain opened up, and I could either shut it down and, go back to the life that I was living, or I could just jump headfirst right through it. And so I did the latter, walked away from, a 15-year career, walked away from a relationship, walked away from pretty much my entire social circle, and essentially became a monk. I gave away 90% of my net worth. I, basically challenged myself to remove all external sources of safety, of security, of appreciation, love, validation, belonging. I forced myself into a process where I had nothing. I was celibate for a while. I literally took away all the crutches, all the coping mechanisms, all the devices, just everything that I was using to buffer against parts of myself. And I just dove right into the rabbit hole, trying to understand who I was, trying to understand what is this? What is this experience of being alive? What is this experience of being conscious, of being aware, right? And I became obsessed with the human mind. And I spent years just studying how we're put together, how we're wired, who we are. And the more I learned about myself, the more I understood other people. And until I got to this point where I realized that there's actually no difference between myself and someone else. And this whole thing is one giant fractal. And every single point in this universe is an entry point to the same place. And I started finding these intersections between quantum physics and neuroscience and psychology and spirituality and all these branches of spirituality and psychedelics. And so I've dedicated my life to really develop the unified theory of the human mind, of the human experience. And this is akin to what Einstein was doing with physics. He was looking at it from a mathematical perspective. And I think mathematics is the language of the universe, right?
Yes.
This is one giant algorithm. This is one giant algorithm that knows itself, right? That can experience itself. That can experience itself through, several billion different perspectives. But really, it's actually infinite perspectives, because what we are seeing right now as Ryan is not actually Ryan. It's actually 40 trillion cells. And, a few trillion of those cells form your pancreas, but, they don't know that they're pancreas. But there's some level of self-awareness that permeates through the levels of reality. And it's different. A frog has a lower level of consciousness in a way, because it's not self-reflective. But you are a collection of other things, but you have a sense of self. You have a sense of who you are. You're aware of yourself. And that's really cool.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's the kind of shit that I'm obsessed with. And, I could just spend the rest of my life doing this. And that's what I fully intend to do.
What is up, ladies and gentlemen? I wanted to stop by while I had your ear and share a very special announcement with you. You may have heard people say that we are facing an epidemic of loneliness in the world right now. We believe that this is only half of the story, and that the real epidemic and the root of feeling loneliness is a lack of connection. Do you want to connect to more purpose and passion with the important work you are doing? Do you wish you had closer friendships with people who understand you, listen to you, and are truly present with you? Are you wishing you and your partner could move deeper into love together? The connection in all of these areas comes down to the one most important element of connection: the ability to connect with yourself. If you are ready to see change in your life, if you are ready to feel differently when you wake up in the morning, if you are ready to step into the life you envision for yourself, the first and only route to making these changes is settling in, quieting down, and being able to connect to yourself. Now, this can be a major challenge in today's world with media, culture, and other energies that pull us out of our ability to connect. When you've tried fitness, meditation, and other self-development practices and still find yourself feeling alone and lacking connection, you may be feeling out of options and wondering if you'll ever be able to tap into your full potential that you know deep down is possible in your life. What we have found in working with our clients is that plant medicines, and cannabis in particular, can guide us in having the experience of what true connection looks and feels like. In this way, cannabis can act as a rite of passage for connection and a gateway toward the spouse, tribe, mission, and life you know you are ready for. Now, the pitfall here is that many people become codependent on the medicines, such as cannabis, and expect the medicine to do the work for them. If this continues, what will happen is the user will find themselves reaching for more and more cannabis to feel connection, without taking ownership of their role in the outcome of their experience, and thus they will fall into repeating the same painful patterns. As Zen Buddhism teaches, how you do anything is how you do everything. Therefore, if this painful pattern is showing up in your relationship with cannabis, it is likely a reflection of the same patterns you're experiencing in your friendships, romantic relationships, business, and your relationship with yourself. Learning to work with cannabis effectively will supercharge your experience and will help you get the result you are actually seeking, which is connection. We created a program to support seekers and high achievers like you in doing exactly this, to learn how to work with the healing power of cannabis to connect you back to yourself so you can unlock purpose, passion, and creativity in all areas of your life. What this program will give you is the long-lost user manual for cannabis. This user manual will teach you how to connect with cannabis correctly so that the plant can act as your spiritual aid and ally in life, just as our ancestors understood and practiced. If you're ready to unlock the full power of cannabis, meet like-minded people on the same path as you, build more purpose into your life, and have the most fun doing homework you've ever had, this message is for you. To learn more and qualify for your spot in the program, hop over to our Instagram profile at highly.optimized and book a discovery call. The conscious cannabis revolution is here. Will you be joining us? Sending all of you love. Enjoy the rest of the show. Well, it's official. We are definitely all becoming best friends because this is the exact same rabbit holes I love to go down so much. And I've been nerding out so much on, some deep rabbit holes on, different interdimensional beings and what stage of development they're at and everything. And, what the whole 3D to 5D, what that even means, right? When you hear that spoken, and how our animals and things like that are more 2D, right? They've yet to become conscious. And yet everyone on this earth is, every human rather, is at varying levels of unconscious to conscious, right? And, I've been able to draw some parallel lines, and I'd love to hop into this with both of you guys as well and see what you guys think on this. But I've been able to draw some parallel lines to like, yes, this is what every, religion talks about. This is what every practice of spirituality talks about. This is why you do it, because it's a subtraction, right? In a world where so many people, including myself, and it sounds like both of you guys for a while, we're looking for things to add. Okay, what's a coping strategy? What's going to help me feel safe, right? Looking for things externally to put onto us. It actually ends up paradoxically a much more subtractive thing, right? Like you were talking about getting rid of all of your money, getting rid of all of your coping mechanisms, getting rid of all of your social circle. That is where I have found personally in my own journey to get the biggest aha moments, into intuitive downloads, et cetera. And so, a couple other things I wrote down too is that pain can be a teacher, right? Like, and Paul Chek talks about this all the time, this concept of the pain teacher, in a world full of distractions, when you're in pain, it's really hard to distract yourself from that. Right. And again, like, it sounds like you tried, Ani, right? But eventually you were just like, I've literally tried everything. I've exhausted this option. And when we run away, right, like ultimately the only thing that's going to help us is actually looking inward. Right. And, it reminds me of that saying that one of my good buddies, Mark, says, which is, if you laugh at the devil, he will run away. But you have to have the courage first. You have to find the courage to be able to actually laugh at the devil and have faith that no matter what happens, you are infinite, you will be okay. Even if this lifetime ends, it's just a doorway to another infinite amount of possibility, right? And you were talking about when your father passed and how that really raised your mortality and, or gave rise to your sense of mortality. And I see so many parallels to fitness, right? And I like to draw things to like a control delete, like, let's look at this simply. And, it's like in fitness, we understand like the point is to break down muscle, to build it stronger, right? To get gains. And so it's funny because it's like that in everything, right? But I know, speaking for myself, and I imagine you guys might have a similar point of view, but I'll keep it personal for me. But for so long, I fought the other areas, right? I'd love to go to the gym and do it that way. But when it came to emotions, my mental state, my spirituality, it was like, oh, I don't want to break things down. That feels terrible. Why do I have to do that? Right. And not realizing that it was just the order of the universe. And so, I'm really curious for both of you guys. Like, it sounds like both of you went through your own journeys and then you met. What was the point at which you met and you knew there was something that was almost, how you say, written in the stars about you guys meeting? Like, did you guys have a psychedelic journey where you were like, okay, maybe this is more than just working as business partners, or did you two meet intimately right away? I'd love to hear that part of the story. Like, what was the part where you realized like, oh, maybe there's actually a lot here?
It's one of my favorite stories to tell. So
Yes.
I'm really glad you're asking. So Ani and I are both from New York City, and we lived about 10 blocks away from each other for a number of years in the Lower East Side. We frequented the same Whole Foods, the same gyms, the same chai bar. I mean, we likely ended up in the same place at the same time many times and just never crossed paths. The timing just wasn't right until it was. And once I moved out of the Lower East Side into Williamsburg, Brooklyn, we ended up both attending the same workshop. Neither of us had intended to go to this workshop, but there we were. We were there. We both got free tickets somehow. And I hadn't even noticed Ani in the room until later on in the afternoon. But I got up at this workshop to speak and to share a very heartfelt story about my father and what my relationship was like with him growing up. And according to Ani, this really piqued his curiosity and interest. He was half asleep before this time. Coffee couldn't even help. And my presence in sharing from my heart was what drew him in. And so we were on one of the breaks and he sat patiently waiting to speak to me after someone else I was speaking with. And I could feel his presence there. Ani has a very striking physical appearance, but he also has a very penetrating yet loving, energetic presence. And I could feel him standing to the left of me. And he wasn't going anywhere. I was talking to someone and he was just standing there in very close proximity. And when we started talking, and throughout the course of that day, we had multiple conversations. And I just had this feeling of being at home, being comfortable. Finally, there was a man that I was speaking to that I didn't feel like I needed to impress. I didn't have to pull all the stops for all the things that would make me desirable or more lovable. And this was just a way that I was used to showing up in the world as a woman at that time. And we just dropped right into deep conversation that really let me know that we were speaking the same language, we were riding the same wave. And it was later that day where, seemingly out of nowhere, I said, I think you're the man I've been asking for. And like I'd mentioned earlier, I thought that in a professional context. Because of the conversation we had, I was like, this guy really knows what's up. We've had a lot of conversations about intimacy, masculine, feminine polarity, our views on sexuality and sexual expression. And I made it a point before the end of the day to ask for his information because I wanted to get the ball rolling on some business connections. And when we met up, listen, okay, Ani's doing air quotes. It did not appear to me as romantic at the time. However, I was the pursuer, but I'll get to that. So of course, I followed up with him because I wanted to get something on the books. I met up with him for coffee. It was 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. I roll up to this coffee shop in the Lower East Side, hair in a bun, no makeup, sweatpants and a sweatshirt. I'm not thinking anything romantic of this. I just want to talk shop. So I get there with the intention of talking shop. I start to share about my personal life as Ani does, which I was not aware of at the time. He just sees all of me. Like we go straight in and he asks these very precise questions that basically unravel me at the seams. And next thing I know, I'm in tears. I am crying in this coffee shop, sitting across from this man that I literally just met days prior. And I'm like, what is happening right now? He sees all of me. We have this transformative experience where I leave having created this breakthrough inside about something that I thought I was missing and that I actually wasn't, a real transformation around self-worth and my readiness to be me in the world. And I remember as I was standing in front of him saying goodbye, I literally said to him, and I typically don't remember these conversations with people, but I said to him, I know I've only just met you, but you are one of few men in my life that I feel really safe with. So thank you. And I gave him a hug and I remember being wrapped in his arms. And I can feel the sensation that I felt when we hugged. And I was like, wow, there is something here. And so I took that with me. And for the following months, for about 3 or 4 months, we remained in platonic friendship. There was no talk, energy, anything around sexuality other than straight conversation about some of the work I was doing in the realm of intimacy. And it was a little confusing for me because throughout this process, I started to ask, do I like this guy? I think I like him. Now I was dating. I was on apps at this time. And so I had a little roster running, but he was the one that I was getting really curious about. And he wasn't putting out any signs. I remember being on conversations with my mom, telling her about him. And one day, after months of being friends, we gave a hug goodbye from a completely platonic hangout. And I was like, I think I like this guy. And so fast forward to a few weekends later, I ended up inviting him on a trip with some of our friends to Maine, completely random, very kismet though, because we were going to end up partaking in some psychedelic substances on this trip. And as we did that throughout that weekend, I remember really opening my heart, feeling the desire to be close to him, feeling the desire to touch him. And again, it wasn't anything sexual, but I just wanted to be in his presence because having him in mind felt so good. And so I remember we were sitting around the campfire one evening when we were in the psychedelic space. And I had a little pep talk with myself. I had been really reflecting on how I was feeling. And I was like, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to tell him. I walked up to him. He's in his own world, staring into the campfire. And I said, Ani, I just want to let you know I'm low key in love with you. Like I had to keep it casual, of course.
Yeah, of course.
Like, I'm not too in love with you, but I'm low key in love with you.
Low key, yeah.
And his response was, thank you for sharing that. And I was like, okay, great. Because the pep talk I had had with myself right before that was, do not be attached to his response. You don't need anything. You are only here for the sake of your expression and to share this. And if you do, you can consider this complete. And so I did, and I felt complete. And it was incredible to have that interaction and to really express what was coming up for me and to not be attached. And that, I will say, leading up to that moment was the progressive knowing that I had inside of me from both an intellectual and an embodied perspective that there was definitely something here beyond a professional context.
I love that. And I'd love to hear Ani's point of view on this too, because, the air quotes killed me. I had to really refrain from laughing so much. And, it's really funny. I won't get into the whole story right now before Ani shares, but, I had a very similar experience with the woman I'm with right now, with Rachel, right? With my partner. She pursued me, and it was so funny because you'll hear her talk about this. Like, yeah, she had to give me some serious hints. Finally, she was like, do you want to trip on mushrooms alone? And I was like, okay, yeah, maybe I'm starting to get this. And I was just completely blind to what was happening. And so I love this story right now.
Yeah, I had a very prolific career in terms of love and dating and sex and relationships before Lee. And for a while, after that turning point that I described, I just completely unplugged because relationships had become a coping mechanism. Sex had become a coping mechanism. And it was a very enjoyable coping mechanism. It was great. But I just didn't want something to have that much power over me. And I also started sketching out this vision for what a relationship, connection, intimacy could look like. And it really was antithetical to how we as a society think about relationships. It didn't really center on commitments and, a legal status or, spending time together doing, experiencing mutual interests like liking the same music and movies and going out to dinners and dates. Like there was something very different, very specific that I was looking for. And what I realized was that for me to have what I really wanted, and that this is something that I didn't really know. I'd never experienced it before. I just had this sense that was coming from that same inner knowing that has directed me my entire life, that there was a level to this game of intimacy that's far beyond what anyone really understands, because it really can't be understood by the conceptual mind, right? The ego mind, the thinking mind, the conceptual mind, the rational mind can't really wrap its head around that. And for me to access that, I first needed to go through a process of subtraction, as you so eloquently put it. So I had to first remove all the things and really understand and be with myself so intensely, so intimately, that I could first have that level of intimacy with myself before I sought to have that with another person. So I spent years just developing and cultivating that intimacy with myself, just learning how to access, channel, but also contain my sexual energy, which is why she didn't get any sexual energy from me, right? Because, as a society, we don't teach kids these things, right? We shame and repress and suppress sexual energy in general. And, we've all grown up in cultures where that was the case to various degrees. So I had to really learn to master my own energetics, to really develop deep levels of intimacy with myself, to really learn to be with myself unconditionally, to be a space for myself, to really listen to myself, to be really present with myself before I tried to, have that with anyone else. So I was in a deep devotional practice with myself in this way for a while before we met. And my bar had gotten so high that I was looking for a very, 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 very specific kind of person. I wasn't really interested in anything, casual. I wasn't interested in surface level stuff. And when we met, I saw the raw potential that Lee had, but I could also tell that she was not in that phase. She was still dating around, and that's great. But I didn't want to be the reason. I didn't want to be the catalyst for her, disengaging from the life that she'd created, because, that would eventually lead to resentment. In the beginning, it would be a big, intense spike of hormones and endorphins and oxytocin and dopamine. But when that started wearing down, it would quickly turn into resentment, because I would be the reason she gave up on those things. So I had to give her the space to come to that conclusion herself, right? To willfully, consciously, intentionally, at her own speed, on her own accord, disengage from what she was in and come to the conclusion that what she wanted was something, far more interesting. And I couldn't be involved in that process. Secondly, I could also tell, and this is right when we met, and, I can tell this about pretty much anyone where they are. I can really feel people at a really deep level and see them. But I could tell that her primary way of relating in the world was from a place of lack of safety. And most women, unfortunately, just have never felt safe in their bodies, right? And they've never really felt safe with men, because, generationally, for thousands of years, it's just not been an option. So most women carry some level of a trauma response in their body at all times. And their nervous system, their body, their mind has never really fully settled into what we call state zero, which is, just completely relaxed, calm, peaceful, open, present, and so, women live their entire life in that. And I can feel that in people. So that wasn't the place that I wanted to begin something. So it would need to be a certain amount of time, an indefinite amount of time, because I was not in any rush. There was no agenda on my part. There was no motive on my part. But we needed to get to that place, at least between each other, where her nervous system could relax and settle and rest to a level that she'd never experienced before. And what that required was that there would be complete absence of sexual energy, complete absence of an agenda, complete absence of a need or attachment or anything coming from me, because she'd never actually experienced that with a man, right? So I needed to repattern and give her a reference point for embodied safety, for real intimacy, for presence, for being held in an unconditional space, right? Where she feels completely safe. And so, some of this was conscious, but a lot of this is just how I live. It's just how I operate. And there's almost like a lack of a distinction between my knowing and my thinking, right? And so it just was a seamless emerging. And I was just allowing this to happen as I do in life. And I think what it led to was a foundation that, people who end up in relationships rarely are able to cultivate, because so much of how we relate to each other, even as, forget romantically, but just as people, it's so much a product of our conditioning. And our conditioning is a product of traumatized people who are hurting, and, they're hurting on the inside and they're hurting others unconsciously, unknowingly. It's completely innocent. But there's so much hurt in the world, and that contaminates and it pollutes the relational space. And as a result, most people in relationships don't really feel safe. Most individuals in the world don't really feel safe. And this is part of the work that I'm really pioneering. It's allowing a space where a human being can feel so profoundly safe, right? Safe to be in their body, that they don't have to escape into their mind. Safe to be in their body so they can be fully open and receptive. Safe to be in their body so that they have access to all parts of themselves. Safe to be in their body so they have access to the life force energy that is flowing through them, which is also the sexual energy, which is also creativity, which is also love, which is also wealth and money and abundance. Because only then can we truly be who we are, can we fully experience and express our full potential. And I wasn't really interested in anything less. So even when she said, "I am low-key in love with you," there was a part of me that was like, beautiful, I received that. And that was an edge for me, right? To not, to see the opening, but not really take it, to just say, thank you for sharing that, which was my truth. And again, not really need for it to turn into anything, to have an agenda for anything to happen, right? And I think that non-attachment, I think that unwavering presence is what allowed her to, in her own space, without feeling any of my stuff, really understand what she wanted, what her needs were, what her boundaries were, what her desires were, what her fantasies were. And I don't think women really get to have that, right? Because when men see an opening, they move in, right? They close
Absolutely.
the space, right? And so typically for a woman, she really doesn't get the time, the space, the energetic sanctity to really understand who she is and what she wants and how she feels. And I think that's one of the most priceless gifts that men can give women, not just in a romantic context, right?
Mm.
I mean, we run 3 companies between the two of us, and we have an entire team, and all of them are women. And, our team meetings, we're regularly just sitting with feelings. We're holding space for what's happening, right? If someone on our team is stressed or in distress, or, something's happening in their life, we don't push it aside. We don't ask them to compartmentalize it. We don't ask them to push it down, right? We create a space where that can come out, right? And even then, there is no agenda or like, hey, let's get through this so we can move on and get to this part. No, let's actually allow a space where what needs to be felt can be felt, what wants to be seen can be seen, what needs to be known can be known, not just by you as the individual, but by a compassionate witness, someone who's there holding that space for you. And I think that's really special, right? Being witnessed changes us. It's so fundamental to us because we are not individuals, right? We are a complex web of relationships, right? Even me, I'm 40 trillion cells that are related to each other because there is no me, right? And so there is just like no one cell in my body can survive by itself. Like I cannot survive by myself. I'm only alive by virtue of who I'm related to, right? And so we need that relational space. And so a relational space can be the most ultimate, profound resource for us, right? And that's what our relationship is meant to do in this world, right? We've come together to change the paradigm around relationships, around intimacy, around sex, around how we relate to ourselves, how we relate to each other, and how do we relate to the world. Because a relationship has to be a win-win-win. It has to be a win for me, it has to be a win for you, and it has to be a win for the community, right? And that's where the magic is.
Yeah, that was beautifully stated. And, reminded me of, what intimacy breaks down into, right? Into you, me, see, right? Like, and for me, relationships, especially with Rachel, that was the first partner that once again, had a similar thing where when we first met, she had a boyfriend and I'm not a homewrecker. So that was off limits, right? And we gained a great friendship. And I remember we both worked at a dispensary. And so, in the trim room, things would get real. We would just start talking. And, I had just gotten out of another relationship where we had explored some different types of lifestyles and we shared that. And she was like, oh, that's really cool. Right. And there was like a block there, right? There was no me giving her sexual energy. There was no her giving me sexual energy. It was just a man and a woman exploring just their lives together. And then one day I remember she came into work and she just turned to me and she was like, I think I'm going to break up with my boyfriend. And I was like, oh, cool. And she had been telling me, some things about, just that they were growing apart, nothing crazy. And again, it was like, oh, cool. Awesome. Like high five, I guess, and then that was what, like, eventually, she'll say it now, like, I had to pretty much like smack you in the face to get you to realize what I was trying to do. And I don't think I've ever been able to put words to what you just stated, Ani. And, it's funny because as someone who I wouldn't necessarily identify myself as someone who would do what you were doing, right? But in a way, I was able to just see like, yeah, actually, that is why her and I worked so well, because I gave her all of the room to really figure out what she wanted and how she wanted it to look. And that's why her and I vibe so well. And, very similar to you guys, we had gone to so many shows. We're in the Boston area. So we had gone to so many concerts, very similar. We had always been in the same space, but just never crossed like immediate paths. And then I remember she came into the dispensary and one day and got an interview. And she came over to me after. I was one of the bud tenders working, and we just started talking. And I remember, I was telling her like, oh, I'm a grower. She's like, I grow too. And I'm like, really? I'm like, that's amazing. And because you just don't meet enough women growers. And, small side tangent. I mean, women are the best people to grow cannabis because cannabis is feminine, and the energy that gets put into that plant by women is amazing. And so we were nerding out over grow talk, and then she got hired. And so we had such a great friendship based on a lot of common interests and things like that. And we always in our relationship now, we've been together 4 years, and we always have conversations. If one of us is feeling off, whether it's with the other one or just in general, right? We'll talk about it. And, one of the things I learned very early on was, hey, don't play Mr. Fix-It, right? Just hold space, right? And that's a trait of the divine masculine, right? And, to not feel as though I need to go fix things, but just to really hold that presence. And, it brings me to my next question, which is, in the modern world, right? And I know we went over a little bit of this, but I'd love to touch on this too. In the modern world where there are dating apps, there are all these distractions, right? Human beings are very in analysis paralysis, right? They're very upregulated as a collective. Of course, there are people that aren't, but as the majority are, what are some challenges that you guys have both seen in relationships these days? And how do you advise people move through them? Like maybe, for instance, you see that, people are always distracted by like, all right, well, if we have one issue, there's 10 other people waiting for me, right? So how do you guys work through those issues? And I know this is a big subject we get into, but just whatever comes to mind first.
So I'll speak from both personal experience and what we've seen with clients. Is the biggest thing that we see are issues that aren't even happening in the here and now. Yes, there is a catalyst that inspires a reaction, but typically, because of the way we form and develop, a lot of the things that are coming up between couples now, the origin of that emotion or what's happening comes from a much earlier time. So often we see couples navigating things and talking about one issue, but the root of that is so much deeper. And so one of the things that we have navigated in our relationship is working backwards to understand what the root of this emotion is, what the origin of this conflict pattern is, or this narrative is. And when we can work backwards to get to the root, we end up disentangling a whole host of things, the fires at the surface that we're trying to put out, that we're just sort of all tending to one after the next when it seems like we just can't get anything right in our relationship. A lot of those things are all stemming from one or two root causes. And those root causes were typically developed at some point in early childhood. And these are, facets of our developmental psychology when we were young, from the ages of 0 to 7, sometimes prior to birth, where we formed some sort of insecure or disorganized attachment style with our primary caregivers. And so this is one of the first times that we would have gotten the message that we're not lovable, we're not worthy, we're too much, we're not enough. And these are typically interpretations that we make because of an event or a series of events that occurs in the household.
And often these interpretations, if you are up for tag teaming.
Yeah, go for it.
These are unconscious, right? So it sounds very simplistic, when we talk about it, but for a lot of people, it's not even in the light of their awareness. So they're not conscious of that. This is how they feel, but this is the reference point from which they act. They show up in their relationships because the relationship becomes the space where we project all our mommy and daddy stuff onto our partner, right? Relationships as adults is where we go really to resolve our childhood attachment issues, essentially. Right? We don't think about it like that. So when we work with couples and when we teach our flavor, we have a company together called Untamed Intimacy, relational intimacy, and how to really cultivate like crazy levels of that and depth and safety and all of that stuff. But one of the core things we teach is that we don't come to a relationship to like live happily ever after. It's actually the opposite. We come to a relationship to do our work and to help our partner do their work. We come to a relationship to willingly be projected on, right? Because that's guaranteed going to happen, right? We come in to receive their, not just the positive projection, right? But also the negative projection. We come to also do the projecting, right? Because that's how we're going to see. And our system on the inside is recreating all those early childhood dynamics with our caregivers in this relationship, because it's trying to complete and resolve a lot of those unresolved loops. Now, the big problem is that most people who enter into relationships are not aware of any of this. So this is not an explicit agreement. It is not a conscious, intentional choice that they make. It's unconscious.
Yeah, this is definitely not in people's wedding vows. Like, forever till death do us part, and just project all of your mommy and daddy issues all over me. I do.
Yes. But if people had that understanding, I mean, think about how much power would be able to come from that, right? If you were to understand, like, hey, there's going to be some times, right? It's almost like if someone could tell you, hey, when I get hungry, I get a little different, right? Like, we all understand those things. But when it comes to these patterns that we all have, right? I'm careful to use binary language, but in this case, you know, it's almost like our duty, right? To explore these things. And I love that you guys brought that up, because, you know, Rachel and I both went through a program called Training Camp for the Soul, and you guys might be aware of it, but they work on all that stuff, mother, father stuff. And it was really funny, you know, and through our last couple psychedelic experiences too, we really had a good cosmic giggle at a lot of it, right? Because even during the psychedelic experience, certain things would come up and she'd be like, oh, no, that's my mom. And I'd be like, oh, that's my dad, right? And it's so funny to be able to have that, because then you can laugh at the devil and he will run away.
Right. And it's really crucial for us to understand a lot of these dynamics, because if we don't, what happens is, and you talked about what are some common challenges. So, you know, people are showing up to relationships completely unaware of this. They don't talk about this before coming into a relationship, right? We want to normalize, like, hey, when you go on a date, how about talking about your childhood dynamics, right? How about talking about some of the core things that shape who you are? And what happens is, when there is a lack of consciousness, right, with the self and with the other, we play out the same patterns and then we loop. So looping is something we see over and over again, where we loop in relationships. We attract the same kind of partners. We stay with them for a similar amount of time. For both Lee and I, it was like roughly 2 years. And then that cycles out typically in a similar way. And then we just start the loop over again. And, you know, people are looping mostly for years till they decide to just compromise and find someone, because time's running out, quote unquote, right? And society needs me to be in a relationship, otherwise I'm not good enough. And, you know, we're doing relationships completely backwards. We're doing it for all the wrong reasons. And because of those expectations being misaligned, relationships become a disaster. And that's why the divorce rate is like over 50%. That's a real problem, because this is, you know, we're talking about relationships, but I think this is actually the solution to some of the world's biggest problems, right? When relationships are fucked, like, the kids who are raised in those relationships are fucked. And I mean that, you know, with a lot of compassion, but trauma is just passed from generation to generation until someone's brave enough to feel it, right? So
absolutely,
the kids then perpetuate the same dynamics. That's how we end up with, you know, someone like Trump. That's how we end up with someone, you know, who's just amassing, you know, weapons and waging war and, you know, allowing, you know, kids to die of malnourishment, like allowing, you know, millions of people to be incarcerated. We're literally caging human beings. This is society, right? This is society. It's so divisive. We're creating so much separation, you know, where there's so much scarcity. And all of this is coming from these adults who have wounded inner children inside, right? And that is a failure of the institution of relationships. That is a failure of us as a species not really knowing how to relate to each other, not really knowing how to relate to ourselves, not really knowing how to be a parent, because there's no school for being a parent. You can just have a kid.
Yeah.
Right. And then that kid is going to go out and carry this imprint into the world. That's how we end up in a world full of hurt people who hurt people. And so I think this, you know, this is a relational conversation, but it's a global impact. The ripple effect goes out into every single thing. It goes out into our education system. It goes out into our healthcare system. It goes out into our political systems. It goes into every tendril of society. And I think, you know, something that, I mean, the reason why we're together in, like, intentionally, is to change the world by helping people have better relationships. And I think that is, the core, because that is the first world that we experience as kids. When we're born, our world is our parents, are the people who are there to take care of us because we're helpless. We are dependent on them for survival. And that's where we learn about the world. That's where we learn if the world is a safe place, if I am enough, if I feel safe, right? Or if there's something wrong with me. And that's the place where we can have the maximum impact.
Yeah. I mean, it makes so much sense. The mother is the relation to ourselves. The father is the relationship to others. And the universe speaks to me in some hilarious downloads. And, one of the ones that came through for me was like, a relationship should be a ship to take your ability to relate. Right. And if we are able to act as mirrors for one another, then we're able to see like, oh, actually, we're much more similar than we are different. Right. But where attention goes, energy flows. And unfortunately, / maybe fortunately, who knows? I mean, it's not the end of the story yet. But right now, what I see is a lot of people not knowing how to relate to one another and then getting triggered over it and then thinking that their trigger is like important enough to continue that disconnection, right? So instead of seeing their trigger or something is like, hey, that's something I want to work on, and maybe that's coming from mom or dad, it's just, this is it. And you need to stop doing what you're doing because I feel this way, right? And then unfortunately, society, because the powers that be are also having these same challenges, they're saying, yeah, you have a right to feel that way. And you know what? Like, don't let anyone tell you that, you should be able to say that around them or et cetera, et cetera. And it just keeps throwing gasoline on the fire. And I love the work you guys are doing because it is so important. I mean, I know over the last 5 years, being able to understand so many things that came from my mother and father, and, they were amazing and they are amazing. But ultimately, this is the thing that I want people to know. The most challenging part about going through training camp for the soul for me was that I was listening to people who like had some legitimate, just like, yeah, that's definitely an issue, right? Like that's easy to see, like, abuse, things like that. My parents didn't do any of those types of things, right? So I became in this way of thinking of like, oh, like everything was perfect. What do I have to be upset about, right? But the problem is, or the challenge becomes that it doesn't have to be a legitimate act that was done to you, right? It can be patterns you saw played out between your parents that had nothing to do with you, right? So even if your parents loved you, they said all the right things, there were things that you picked up that are, again, unconscious, like you were talking about, Ani, that are ultimately going to play into your ability to relate to yourself and others. And that's like the big sleeping giant I feel so many people are missing. And not to mention, I mean, most people are really unaware of all of this stuff, right? And I mean, how would they be? I mean, look at the modern education system. I mean, we don't learn about any of this, but, we learn about the Pythagorean theorem, right? Not to diss the Pythagorean theorem, but I just really feel there are things that are a little bit more useful for our daily life than very advanced math, right?
There's something about an isosceles triangle that just really gets me going.
Yeah. It's the angles, man, Yeah. Well, guys, I mean, this was absolutely amazing. And, we're going to definitely have to do a round 2 on this too. And I'd love to get you guys on Highly Optimized as well. And you guys offer so many amazing things. Ani, I know you have a podcast. Lee, do you do that podcast with Ani, or is that a separate thing? I want to give you credit where credit is due.
Absolutely. So I've got a podcast called The Way of the High Priestess.
Awesome. And Ani, yours is You Are Limitless, correct?
Correct.
All right. Awesome.
So limitless.
Yes. Guilty as charged, And guys, make sure you check out their podcast. I want to give you guys a chance to plug anything you have going on, any upcoming workshops where people can find you and connect with you, because the people who listen to both of my podcasts, Highly Optimized, this one time on Psychedelics as well, are very motivated, right? Very curious about these things, right? They are people that are aware that they're excited to get into this kind of stuff. And I really want to give them a platform. I mean, if it's one thing I've learned about you guys in the very short amount of time that, we got to talk today, it's that you guys are very high level when it comes to this type of stuff. And, I've done my fair share of different programs, and I'm actually very interested as well in working with you guys. So please let people know where they can find you, how they can get in touch with you, and any upcoming like big workshops, where the podcasts are at, any of that stuff.
I invite everyone to tune into our podcast. We also have a shared podcast called Untamed Intimacy. If you are desiring to connect with me, Instagram is the best way. I'm at @LeeNoto_. You can also visit more about my individual work and our shared work at leenoto.com.
Yeah, and you can find me at ani.manian, Manian, on Instagram, animanian.com. And yeah, like we've been doing a lot of cool stuff. And we're really playing this experiment of seeing what people want, because we like getting really creative with this. So, if you're listening to this and any of this piques your curiosity, shoot us a message on Instagram and, just share what resonated and what would be most helpful. And we can spin up a 1-day, 2-day immersion. We can spin up a retreat. We're both more interested in responding to what people want, rather than, coming up with stuff and then, seeing who wants that. I feel like that it loses some of the connection. We love this work. Typically when we work one-on-one, this is like the most deeply intimate experience. We do a lot of things differently than most psychedelic facilitators, including one of the things we do is cannabis-assisted somatic psychotherapy.
Oh, beautiful.
So, cannabis, for example, you mentioned working at a farm, we misunderstand cannabis completely. And
yes,
a future episode, we can talk all about like how cannabis can actually be a huge gateway to accessing the self and working with the nervous system and resolving trauma and really, opening ourselves up to just all of it. So get at us, share some ideas, tell us what you're up to, what you're interested in, and we'd love to support.
It's so amazing you just mentioned cannabis in that way. I know we just met, so you guys might be unaware, but cannabis it's my biggest teacher. And also it's what I've dedicated my life to. I've been a cultivator for the last 12 years using biogeometry and organic cultivation practices, Korean natural farming, and working with the land. And I just created a program called Connect with Cannabis, which is all about how to actually connect with cannabis in a way that allows it to be a Swiss Army knife rather than just a knife, right? And, so many people are unaware of exactly what you were talking about, the ways in which cannabis can help us. Yeah. And it all starts with the simplicity of intention, right? Like asking for what you want, right? And also surrendering to how that actually manifests. I had a friend who, I just started the second cohort of this program, and he was sharing this experience. He was going through some real big challenges with his father, sick, and just a lot of pressure in life. And, we were looking to play Can Jam one day. I don't know if you guys know Can Jam, but it's like a Frisbee game, super fun. And we were making a bag in the volcano. And I was like, hey, what's your intention before you hit that bag? And he was like, I want to let go. I want to let go and I want to feel better on the other side. Awesome. Hits the bag. We're getting ready to play Can Jam. And I'm like, hey, you ready to go? And he's like, I don't know, man, I'm not feeling too hot. Right. And so over the course of 5 minutes, he starts to get pale, sweaty, and finally just outbursts crying, right? Like sobbing for 15 minutes. Right. And I go over, I help him, I work him through some stuff. And afterwards he felt better. And I'm like, hey, you got what you wanted. Right. And so the ways in which these things can manifest look much different than what we might think we want. And that's what's so powerful with intention, is that, that's where faith comes in so heavily, because when you're working with these medicines, especially cannabis, cannabis is so powerful. And, most people, including myself for many years, interact with it unconsciously, which then numbs them out because it will act as the overprotective mother, right? And it will just pull the wool over you. It'll make you pizza rolls or whatever you want, and it will just relax you, right? And so that's one way to interact with it, right? And, I'm not going to say there's never a time that you should numb out with it. There are certain times where you just need to like control alt delete for a second and get some headspace and heart space back. But it's so amazing that you brought that up, Ani, because, cannabis is just such a undervalued plant and a misunderstood plant. There's so much research coming on mushrooms and LSD and MDMA and everything. And those are amazing medicines, right? But, with cannabis, it's just, especially in the industry, it's like smoke it all day. You can't get addicted and you won't get cancer. So just whatever, right? And it's like, yikes, that's so detrimental,
I'll be the first one to say it. We've served everything from MDMA, psilocybin, 5-MeO, everything in between. And I would consider cannabis to be the most powerful psychedelic that human beings have access to.
Yes.
And used in an intentional way, it is absolutely life-changing. It's been my greatest teacher. And, it's something that, speaking of relationships, has really been a very, very healing, powerful force for us to connect deeper, for us to access parts of ourselves and each other. I feel like we could go on a huge rabbit hole just with cannabis because, there's a whole neurological nervous system based understanding of, even in that anecdote that you shared, what happens with cannabis. Because people think cannabis numbs them out, but actually what it's doing is it's turning off a part of our mind that is considered the secondary consciousness, giving us access to the primary consciousness, which is the consciousness of the body. And so when people say that they smoke cannabis and they get anxious or they have panic attacks or whatever, that's in their system. That's underneath all the time, 24/7.
Mirroring.
Right. And the cannabis is just allowing a space to access that. And most people, what they do is they shut that down, right? Or they turn away from it, and it just cycles in their system 24/7 for the rest of their life. So cannabis is so incredibly powerful and misunderstood. And I think, I can tell that as a species, we're slowly moving in the right direction in terms of the evolution of consciousness, because cannabis is becoming more legal by the day. And it is, that is, I think, one of the primary change agents for consciousness on the planet.
Yes. Wow. You guys are amazing. This is so incredible. And that was just like a nice little bonus point. We're going to have to come back and do a full episode on cannabis. And I mean, we didn't even get into like what cannabis can do for sex and all of those things as well. I mean, talk about a connector, right? I mean, Rachel and I, again, we've both been growing for years. And so, what we've found is that by cultivating in a certain way, by putting biogeometry in the rooms, by cultivating with the full soil food web, and if you do aquaponics and aquatic food web too, you get such a more broad array of terpenes, which allow you like the permeability of your whole entire ability to connect just to go so much deeper. And so I'm extremely excited to dive into that with you guys, because it's extremely rare to find people I can talk like this with on cannabis. I think you guys are really one of the only people besides Paul Chek or someone like Shervin Jaffariad that, actually understands how cannabis works in this way. So I am smitten to talk to you guys again.
Oh, we're so excited. Maybe there's a retreat collaboration in order.
Yes. I would love that. Where are you guys located right now, actually?
We're in Austin. Where are you?
Oh, perfect. I'm coming to Austin in 2 weeks. Nice. Just, FYI, I'm in Boston. So we rhyme. Boston and Austin. Yeah.
Nice.
Great.
Yeah. So we'll definitely be meeting up in 4D when I come out there. I'll be out there, I think, from the 8th to the 11th. I think there's 7th to 11th, one or the other. So
great. Nice. We'll take you on a hike and
yes.
We'll bring some cannabis as well.
Awesome.
For the journey.
I am so excited. And guys, I have one last question, and you guys can both, give an answer to this. And that question is this, if someone listening was just swayed by the both of you to experience psychedelic medicines for the first time, what is one piece of advice you would give them to allow them the smoothest experience possible?
That you already have all the answers. These substances are beautiful catalysts and tools and entry points into parts of ourselves that are already there, are always there. We have access to these parts of ourselves anytime we choose to go deep within. And so these substances become tools for us, and we already have all of the answers. They shine the light on the places within us that sometimes we wish to see and sometimes we do not wish to see. Yet everything is already contained within.
Beautifully stated.
I'll share something that came to me actually during a psychedelic experience. And while I'm gonna share this in response to your question about experiencing psychedelics for the first time, I think I use this as a general maxim for life, which is ask for what you want, surrender, receive.
Another beautiful statement. And yeah, that is so perfect, because what I found in my own journey is that until I learned the surrendering process, right? It's like Terence McKenna talks about, by hurling yourself into the abyss and finding the feather bed on the other side, right? That is like the description of surrender put into like perfect Terence McKenna words. I mean, that guy was such a poet. And so I absolutely love that. And guys, When I was first connected with these two amazing souls through our mutual friend Clayton, I felt my heart expand and my focus intensify as I began dreaming of the incredible ride we would be going on within this episode and life as a whole. Ani and Lee are perfect examples of just how much is possible in our lives when we choose to color outside the lines and embody faith in the process of our experience of life. I believe that human beings are moving through an incredible time in history, which includes transcending the limitations we have long believed to make way for a new, more harmonious Earth at large. This being said, this process can be challenging as within it, we must ultimately leave behind much of what we have known up until this point. Going through this path alone is a daunting task, to say the least. And therefore, if you listened to this and felt a resounding yes from your heart, reach out to Ani and Lee for assistance in moving into this new frequency with grace and ease. I believe we can all agree that it is our divine birthright to experience bliss, and that by having guides that allow us to traverse these new planes of existence, we can reach this state quicker and be better able to help our fellow brothers and sisters that are yearning to learn how to achieve this state as well. Ani, Lee, thank you so much for what you do and for being the bright lights that you are. And until next time, may your journey be smooth and full of light. Aho.